Hey guys, Liana here. I know I don't post videos normally on the weekend, but I didn't do a video Friday because I had medical issues. And I really want to make sure I give this game some coverage because I think that developers like Ubisoft should be rewarded when they give press a solid hour with a game that's in an alpha build. I really appreciate the access, and it's something I want to encourage, so I was pretty hell bent um, to make sure there's some coverage. Now, if there are kind of long pauses or I seem a bit slow, I am still recovering. I'm not going to get into the details because I don't spew my life on the internet, but I am still sort of compromised, but I wanted to make sure this was done. So, and the only other thing I should probably disclose is Ubisoft gave us lunch. I know some people care about that, but we didn't receive financial compensation for this, but they did feed us. So we're supposed to disclose whenever we consume anything. It's more like going for a prostate exam than reviewing a game these days. But there you have it. So, what can we say about Far Cry Primal? The focus of this hands-on was the Beastmaster elements of the game, which means you have a of animal companions on top of your weapons that you can tame in the game world and then use them as almost a co-op partner to defeat enemies, take over camps, all that stuff. And of course, my dog decides to bark when I'm talking about animal companions. My dog would not last 5 minutes in Far Cry Primal. He is a wuss. But it's interesting. The game still needs balance where the animals are concerned, but the core mechanics of treating them like a co-op partner, like an AI co-op partner, instead of a weapon, I really liked. And there's a lot of things within the game that deliberately have you form an emotional attachment to these animals. You pet them, you feed them. They're animated when they're not in combat so that they're sort of cute and cuddly, even though they're these prehistoric killers of time, space, and death animals. But they're really trying to make you use them like a partner that you want to have not die, and not, this bazooka that you just fling in and who cares how much ammo you waste. Now, not everybody's going to play the game that way, and there's no real penalties for playing the game that way, and I like that as well because that's true player freedom, right? The game isn't forcing you to be an animal lover. You can be a different kind of Beastmaster who doesn't really care about the animals he tames, but the fact that the game nudges you in the direction of caring for your animals instead of shoving you is something I really enjoyed. Now, the game balance does need work. I found it really easy. They've still got time for that, and the important thing about it is the core mechanics are solid. The idea is good. I'm sure through play testing they will balance it. Again, this was just an alpha of the game, which means balance is one of those things you don't factor in. You assume it's going to be off. They haven't tweaked that. I did hear there's a better build that way being used, but that wasn't installed onto the computers that we use, so we got the alpha mode. The other thing I asked about, and obviously they're not giving details, but they did give me hints, was the idea of the story and how much sort of Far Cry's traditional narrative structure is going to continue, because we don't have the option of a failed state 12,000 years in the past during, caveman days. And they apparently still have the mysticism elements that feature heavily in previous Far Cry games. There is sort of a cultural element that they can't get into, but they did say it is there. And instead, they do this interesting stuff that the language in the game is apparently done with a paleolinguist. So it's as close to the sort of Indo-European early human dialect as they can get. It's as close as they can get, because obviously there's huge gaps. It was oral, and there wasn't. Um, But I found that really interesting because that's a detail that probably took a lot of work and probably cost a lot of money. And that sort of thing is a labor of love. It's an artistic element instead of it being a core, business decision in terms of video games making a lot of money. The non-numbered Far Cry games tend to be interesting. They don't completely follow the format, and yet they do in the same way. So I'm very interested in that way. The other thing about the game is how surprisingly visually stunning it is. You know how in the previous Far Cry games they used, colored flags or clothing or, things like that to create really beautiful color palettes for the game. Color palettes, the blue and the orange and then the reds and the greens are very, very significant in Far Cry games. And I was curious how they were going to do that in a game that has very, very early humans in it. You don't have the states, never mind the failed states, that they deal with in the Far Cry games. And the way they did that with things like wildflowers and, pops of color that way. There's a gorgeous day to night sunset effect that actually makes it harder to see because everything's sort of red, but that's deliberate because I don't know if you've ever driven into the sun during, a prolonged sort of sundown period. It happens all the time when I'm driving east to west in Toronto during afternoon rush hour. The sun's constantly in my eyes and you can't see. It's tough, but it's a beautiful kind of handicap in that regard, and I really like the fact that they changed it up that way, and they do have a day to night cycle. And the gameplay is based on obviously rudimentary weapons, and they shy away from the realistic brutality of the injuries those weapons cause. I don't know if you guys have seen the way those early sort of axe clubs cracked open people's skulls, but it's gruesome. And they shied away from that, obviously, because they want the game to be fun, not a scarring experience. So they did dodge that actual effect of what hitting somebody with one of those clubs would do. But I'm glad for that because we're hitting this area in video games where they can get so realistic and they can make, the injuries and the dismemberments and the scars so accurate that every developer has to have this battle with themselves. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I personally prefer when they step away from the violence. I much prefer, the games where if you get a headshot, there's a like this spray of gore. That's not real. A head doesn't actually do that when you shoot it. It doesn't pop like a cherry tomato. I use cherry tomatoes just because I'm terrible at eating cherry tomatoes, and every time I do it, I make a huge mess. Like I bite into it, it goes at the side and sprays whoever's next to me or the window. So that's what I think of when I see those, ridiculous Mortal Kombat style gore effects. It doesn't affect me the same way that realistic violence, for instance, autopsy videos or police videos hit me. It's not real, and your brain knows it's not real. And I think that's a critical thing to talk about in game development, because real violence isn't fun. These sort of blood-filled ballets that we experience in video games are fun. And it's not fun because of the violence. It's fun because of the excitement and the adrenaline. And I think it's good that developers are consciously taking a step back from realistic violence, because we shouldn't glorify realistic violence. We should recognize this isn't something we're going to do in our day-to-day lives. And so what else can I talk about? I talked about the language, talked about the weapons. The perks are still there. They're really subdivided. I looked into it. You have like hunting, you have gathering, you have animal training. There's a bunch of different skills. There was a hint of a female character in the skills menu. they didn't show that female character in the demo, but if you scoot over to one of the talent trees, the menus, there's a clear face. She's a dark skinned woman, so she's a person of color as well, and it's voiced. So there's at least one prominent female character in the game for people who care about that, at least from what I gleaned from this demo. And there's a lot of depth in the experience we were given a hands-on with, because the menus weren't locked off, because all the tutorials were sort of open. The other thing that was surprisingly fun is the way Far Cry Primal allows you to mark enemies. And like previous Far Cry games, there's multiple ways you can go in and capture camps. They have here, you capture campfires, and if you do it wrong, you can set the whole place on fire, which I did once, including my bear companion, who I nicknamed Smokey the Bear, because he was walking around on fire and wasn't too pleased with me. I had to give him a lot of meat to heal him after that, and bears suck up a ton of meat. That's part of the balance of the game. It's not just play style. There's actually a game economy balance that the tankier critters, like the bear, who can take a lot of damage, they also take a lot more resources to heal, and you have to hunt and harvest that meat to keep the bears in fighting shape. Some of the animals with fewer hit points, like the jaguars, require a lot less to heal. The other thing the jaguar does is they don't pull every enemy in the base out of position. So if you want to go in and do those really elegant stealth kills, you can choose which animal to send in. Sometimes you want to pull everybody towards the animal and you just go around in a circle and pick them off. Other times it doesn't make as much sense because there's a guy with a horn and you don't want to deal with the reinforcements. It's the similar Far Cry mechanics told in a different way. And the thing I am going to be very, very interested to watch for as we get closer to the game, I think they said it's launching in February, maybe March. It's soon. But the thing I'm hoping as we get closer to launch that we'll find more about the central plot premise of the game, because I think that's going to be a big seller. So who do I think is going to be interested in these games? It's not going to be somebody who wants a huge amount of core challenge in terms of difficulty. Don't bother. That's not this kind of game. It's one of these games where it's, how do I put this? It is an experience in itself. So you can go in, much like Assassin's Creed, where you can just go there and fight your way through the whole thing and go through waves and waves of enemies and just, hand-to-hand combat it the whole time. Or you can be more elegant and do it stealthily. And yes, that's harder, but Ubisoft does this organic difficulty thing that people either love or hate. You're basically playing the game you want to play it, but you're also playing the game you want to play. So if you want to go in and play it like a stealth game, you can, but the game's not going to punish you for not doing that, other than, the 100%ing the mission. And if you're if you're completionist, yeah, you do have to fill those secondary objectives. But in, Far Cry Primal, the sheer number of options you have approaching an enemy camp, even with the rudimentary tools you're given, are really interesting. I mean, the fact that the owls work almost like drones. You can go in and you can do all your scout and all your tagging of enemies, much like the cameras did in Far Cry 4, or the hunter syringes. But in this case, use your owl. The other thing the owl does, though, is, I call it the go for the eyes boo move. If you hit R2 when a particular enemy is highlighted, the owl will go in and take out that enemy. And I'm sure you're not going to be able to do it with every enemy, but it was crazy fun to do it in the demo. I just kept doing it because I found it so hilarious. It's just like you're soaring around. It's like, I'm an owl. I have owl vision. And all of a sudden it's R2 and the owl goes, ee! And just boom, and right on the head. And the guy's down. And maybe that says a lot about me that I found it funny. But it was just so fun. And that's, I think, sort of the point of this game and what previous Far Cry games have been. It's a big sandbox that focuses on experiential play, and every moment is part of the story. There's a story the player creates with the game world that runs with, it sort of blends into the narrative, but it almost supersedes the narrative. The real story in a Far Cry game isn't the one the game sets out for you. It's what you choose to do within the parameters. So if you want to just be an asshole and blow stuff up and set things on fire, you can. But you can also almost take a role-playing element to it. And that's, that's the sort of experience. If you want something more that's an experience and a beautiful one, and a really fun one when you can experiment with a lot of things, almost like Dishonored was, or like the plasmids in BioShock. That BioShock wasn't a terribly difficult game, but you could play it in a lot of different ways. That's the sort of game Far Cry Primal is. If you're looking for something with a high degree of challenge and you want sort of those bragging rights or that real achievement for finishing it, Far Cry Primal's not that kind of game, and that doesn't make it a bad game. That just makes it the type of game it is. And I reward it for having a very clear artistic vision, being very clear in what kind of game it wants to be, and setting up a really defined world, and a world that I sat down and kind of understood the broad strokes of it within an hour, but it still allows a lot of real player freedom instead of that sort of perception of player freedom that games like the Stanley Parable make fun of. So overall, I think it's a good effort. It's not going to be for everybody. I think it is going to be for fans of Far Cry. The one thing you're not going to get is those big, bombastic, quippy, quotable characters, because nobody in it is speaking a modern language. So that's one thing to think about, but I think the art direction and the sheer raw beauty of the game is going to overcome it. And I went in not knowing very much about Far Cry Primal deliberately, because I don't make up my mind based on game trailers. And I walked out really looking forward to it, just because it's going to be one of those neat, immersive experiences that is what sandbox gaming is supposed to be, as opposed to these icon glutted mission spews that the open world genre is associated with now. I think that it's cool to actually have true sandboxes in gaming, because they've reminded me of how fun actual sandboxes can be when they're designed with care.